With the release of a new Legend of Zelda game comes inspiration for new Legend of Zelda theories. And while playing Echoes of Wisdom, I've come up with 8 theories for you to consider. Some of these I might not agree with, but I think there will be people who do, and I'm curious what you think, so let's get right to it. And of course, this video contains spoilers. Did the Zonai Swirl come from mic crystals? If you're familiar with the Zonai, then you're probably aware that one of their most well-known symbols is the Zonai Swirl. Swirl symbols exist in previous Zelda games, leading people to theorize that the Zonai have existed or been involved in events since the beginning of the timeline. When the first trailer for Echoes of Wisdom was released, people noticed a swirl design in Link's weapons, suggesting that maybe they were Zonai in origin. Playing the game, you know this is not the case, and these weapons were created by Lueburry using mic crystals, minerals that are said to be left behind by rifts. We're told in Echoes that as long as Null has been imprisoned, it's been creating rifts, and mic crystal is left behind when a rift is closed. And during the revised origin story of the universe, there are things shown to be created in the void before time that look almost like mic crystals. It seems like these crystals have existed since before the beginning of time, meaning before the existence of the Zonai. Maybe the Zonai got the idea for the Zonai Swirl from mic crystals. Maybe the Zonai found mic crystal and adapted its design into their own swirl pattern. Did the Sea Zora come from Labrynna? In Echoes of Wisdom, we can find the Sea Zora, who inhabit the waters of Zora Cove. When the trailers for the game first came out, the fact that the Sea Zora and River Zora would be together was a big deal, since the only other game that featured these two groups together before was Oracle of Ages. Echoes uses an expanded version of the map from A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds, and because Zora Cove exists outside the boundaries of those maps, in lore it's possible the Sea Zora were always there, just beyond the playable area. But an interesting point comes from the Oracle games. In Oracle of Ages, we see a full-fledged Zora's village, located in the seas of Labrynna. Even more interesting, if you play a linked file in Oracle of Seasons, you can find a Sea Zora who says he was sent by the Zora King to find somewhere to establish a new settlement. I think the Sea Zora village in Echoes of Wisdom is the new settlement created by the Labrynna Sea Zora sometime after the Oracle games. Echoes most likely takes place in the Downfall timeline. More on this in a later video, specifically at a point after the Oracle games. So the idea of the Labrynna Zora coming to Hyrule later makes sense. And maybe the Jabul Jabu of Jabul Waters is the exact same one we see in Labrynna. Does fixing rifts change Hyrule's map? This one is a theory suggested to me by WizCatches Lightning. The idea is that when the Tries close a rift and fix the land, they maybe don't put everything back exactly where it was, leading to a slightly different landscape. Because Null was imprisoned at the beginning of time, and has been creating rifts ever since, this rearranging of the land would explain why the maps of each game are different, despite most of them taking place in the same Hyrule. I disagree with this theory for a couple reasons. The first is that when we see the Tries fix a rift, everything goes back to exactly how it was. There's no indication of anything being misplaced. The second is that when the Tries fix a rift, they're not actually putting everything back where it was. They're making echoes of the land. At the start of the game, Tri gives Zelda the Tri-Rod, which lets her create echoes, magical copies of things. And after completing the first dungeon, Tri tells us that it and its friends can fix rifts with their echo powers. What's weird is after you fix any of the major rifts in the story, turns out you can go back into the still world of those regions, and the parts of the world that were consumed are still there, even though those rifts were supposed to be fixed. The game basically shows and tells us that when a rift is fixed, the tries recreate the affected area using their echo abilities, meaning they copy and paste what was there, while the original stuff is left in the void. What does it mean if chunks of Hyrule are just magical copies? I have no idea, and I feel like neither does Nintendo or Grezzo based on the quality of the storytelling in this game. Which is kind of a big problem, especially when you consider that most of Hyrule falls into a rift at the end of the game. Are rift survivors echoes? I totally would have loved Echoes of Wisdom if this was the case, but it's not. Like I mentioned in the previous theory, when the tries fix a rift, they are not putting everything back, they're just using their echo ability to copy and paste the chunks of Hyrule into the spots affected by a rift. Because of this, I had a thought that maybe anyone who fell into a rift and was rescued was really an echo as well. One of the points mentioned about rift survivors is that they are affected from their time in the void. The longer they're inside, the stronger they're affected. There are some characters, including Link, who return having lost their ability to speak, and anyone who returns from a rift has the ability to see the tries. I thought this was because the survivors were really echoes who the tries recreated, like how the tries recreate the land, and the original people who fell into a rift were left to fade away. But I disproved my own theory, because if you explore a stilled world after fixing that rift, even though the swallowed land is still there, there are no people to be found. So by the looks of it, when a rift is fixed, the victims who fell inside are indeed returned back to Hyrule, meaning this theory is a bust. Did the gods flood Hyrule because of Null? Just a quick refresher, at the end of Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf is sealed away, and Zelda sends Link back to the past to relive his childhood. That timeline continues without that Link, known as the adult timeline. Eventually, Ganondorf escapes his imprisonment and threatens the land once again. But without a hero, it seemed like there was no one to stop Ganondorf this time. But the three golden goddesses returned to the world and flooded Hyrule, hoping to trap Ganondorf there forever. The thing is, we're told the goddesses not only trapped Ganondorf, but Hyrule itself. And after playing Echoes, there might be another reason why. There's a possibility that Hyrule was flooded to stop Ganondorf from accidentally releasing Null. If Null has been trapped since time began, it would have been trapped even during Ocarina of Time. Meaning when time split 3 ways, there became 3 timelines, each with their own Null. More on this later. In the adult timeline, with no hero to oppose Ganondorf, he may have caused enough damage to allow Null to escape. I don't think it would have been intentional, because I doubt this Ganondorf would be aware of Null. And if he was, I feel like they wouldn't be friends, since one wants to rule the world, and the other wants to eat it. Because there's usually a hero to stop Ganondorf, the goddesses wouldn't have to worry about this. But because there was no hero this time, they may have decided to step in themselves and seal Hyrule away under a great ocean, as an extra countermeasure to stop Ganondorf and keep Null trapped. Was Phantom Ganon banished to the Void? One of the oldest theories that fans of the series have had is something Ganondorf mentions in Ocarina of Time after Link defeats his Phantom. Ganondorf claims to banish this Phantom to the gap between dimensions. What is this gap? This question is something we haven't really had an answer for, but the Void might now fit this description. In the series, we have alternate or parallel universes, or dimensions. The main one we know of is where Hyrule is, but there's also the universe of Termina and the one of Lorule. When we talk about metaphysical stuff like this in the series, we don't have a lot to work with, but if we're factoring in the Void, it could be that each universe has its own Void, or that all existence, meaning every separate universe, exists in this same Void. If the latter is true, that means the Void would be the gap between dimensions, as it is literally what's in between these places. Also notice it says the gap between dimensions, and not just another dimension. The void itself is not a dimension, just nothingness. I also want to give a shout out to an unknown Redditor for suggesting that the space we see Link travel through in A Link Between Worlds is the gap between dimensions, which if we go off my theory, might actually be the void. And Lorule falling apart might be Lorule falling into the void. Was Demise Null's champion? This one was also suggested to me. From my understanding of the idea, Null created Demise to be its champion, in opposition to Hylia being the champion of the Golden Goddesses. Null is trapped in the center of the planet and hates the goddesses, and Demise was said to have come from underground and also hates the goddesses. So that's where this idea comes from. But I disagree with this one too for a couple reasons. The first reason being that Demise fits more as a fallen god, someone who was created by the Golden Goddesses with a specific role, who turns evil for one reason or another. This concept is something I talked about in my Happy Mask Horned Statue videos. The quick summary is that Hylia, Demise, and the Spirit in the Horned Statue line up with the most important gods of Shinto, Amaterasu, Susanoo, and Tsukuyomi. Demise may have been inspired by Susanoo, the god of storms, who was created at the same time as Amaterasu and Tsukuyomi and put in charge of the sea. For one reason or another, he is banished or travels to the underworld, which may be why Demise was written to have emerged from underground. If this is the case, Demise might hate the gods because they basically kicked him out of heaven, not because he's a creation of Null. Also, in Echoes of Wisdom, it seems like Null can't create anything original, only make copies of things. The second reason I disagree with this idea is because of something I mentioned in the Wind Waker theory. Like Ganondorf, Demise wants to rule the world, so he might have issue working for a god who wants to consume everything. Even if you suggest that Demise was created by Null and then turned against it, I still believe, based on the logic and evidence with Hylia, Demise, and the Spirit in the Horned Statue, that Demise was created by the Golden Goddesses, and he, for whatever reason, did something to get himself banished, and has nothing to do with Null. Technically speaking, the theory of Demise being Null's champion could work if we combine both ideas. Maybe Demise was a fallen god who was banished to the underworld, but while there, he discovered Null. Maybe he did become Null's champion, but figured he could use Null to destroy the goddesses, and then afterwards destroy Null itself, which does add another motive for wanting the Triforce. But this is the only way I can think of to make the idea of Demise being Null's champion actually work. Does the Wild Era take place in the Downfall timeline? If Null was imprisoned at the beginning of time, he's been trapped since before Skyward Sword, and continues to be trapped during Ocarina of Time. Meaning, when the timelines split, now we have 3 timelines where Null exists, trapped in the planet. Echoes of Wisdom most likely takes place in the Downfall timeline, where we know he is destroyed at the end of the game. But we know nothing of what happens in the child or adult timelines. Maybe Null is destroyed there as well, during events we will never see or know about. Maybe he just continues to be trapped, even past these timelines, going into Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Or a spicier conclusion, Null was victorious and consumed reality, leaving the adult and child timelines wastelands of infinite nothingness. If that's the case, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom can't really take place in those timelines, meaning the only timeline that is left is the Downfall timeline. But then you'd have to explain how things from the other 2 timelines are referenced in the Wild Era games, if those timelines aren't even connected. I just want to say I don't agree with this theory at all, but I think there will be some people who have this thought. And I did want to briefly talk about the idea of Null winning. I love the character of Null, and it's fun to think about the implications of a Lovecraftian god of nothingness consuming reality. Does Null exist across all timelines? This is a bonus theory I came up with while recording. But do you know the popular theory of how the Triforce represents Null being imprisoned? The 3 pieces for the 3 goddesses, and the hole in the middle for Null. This symbolism might be more important than you realize. There's also the existing idea that each timeline represents a piece of the Triforce. Link defeating Ganon in the adult timeline represents courage. Ganon defeating Link in the downfall timeline represents power. And Link warning the kingdom with his knowledge of the future represents wisdom. When we talked about the previous theory, I mentioned that when time split, each timeline would have its own null. This might be proven wrong by that null Triforce theory. If we imagine each timeline as a piece of the Triforce, and Null is in the middle, that could symbolize that Null exists across each timeline, meaning there is only one void and one Null. The center of the planet where Null is trapped being a space that's shared by each timeline. Null would have 3 timelines to try to escape. The adult timeline, he may have been prevented by the flooding of Hyrule, but in the downfall timeline, because he was destroyed, that might now mean he's been destroyed for every timeline. The reason this makes sense is because we're told in Echoes of Wisdom that Null and the Void actually existed before time, since we know from Ocarina of Time that it was not created until the world was. If this is the case, the timeline splitting should have no effect on Null or the Void because they exist outside of time. Because of this, the Void can be considered a space that each timeline can access, because it exists independently of each split. If true, this idea might also confirm that Phantom Ganon was in fact banished to the Void, if we assume each timeline is a dimension, because like I stated for that theory, the Void isn't a dimension, it's nothingness, and it would be the thing, or the gap, between each timeline. And this would also be another thing that disproves the theory I mentioned of the Wild Era being in the Downfall timeline, because Null would be destroyed in every time, meaning he couldn't consume the worlds of the Adult and Child timelines. And those were 8 + 1 bonus theories from Echoes of Wisdom that I think will be at least mentioned in the Zelda theorizing community. And while I may or may not agree with all of them, I want to know what you think. Do you agree or disagree with anything I said? Or do you have your own theories you came up with while playing? As usual, let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.